Ever get that feeling like you're surrounded by knockoffs? Like we worry about fake designer bags or if we're getting the real deal when we buy electronics online. But that desire for authenticity, like needing the genuine article, it goes way deeper, don't you think?
It really does. It goes right to the heart of, well, the human experience, I'd say. Trying to sort out what's real, what's fake, what's the original, and what's the cheap imitation.
And that takes us right to our deep dive today. We're looking at some ancient instructions. Specifically, we've got excerpts from Lesson 35, Preparation for Canaan. And it's basically Moses giving his final guidance to the Israelites as they're about to, enter the Promised Land. Think about it. You've got these people about to walk into this totally new, probably overwhelming place. New cultures everywhere you look, new ways of life. And this is key, totally different belief systems.
It was a huge transition for sure. And you can see why it would be so risky, right? This generation, the one Moses is speaking to, they haven't lived through the Exodus. They didn't see those miracles firsthand like their parents did. Moses knew that he had to prepare them, not just for a new land, but for a whole new world of ideas and beliefs. It's like these weren't just farewell speeches. They were survival guides for their faith.
Right, exactly. So what we're doing today isn't just, a history lesson. We really want to understand what Moses was trying to get across. What were the absolute essentials, the non-negotiables he wanted this new generation to internalize as they faced this new reality? And thinking about all of us today, what can we take away from his approach, especially as we navigate a world that's just overflowing with different ideas and information coming at us from every direction?
That's a really good point. It's a timeless challenge, trying to stay grounded, hold on to your convictions when you're surrounded by so many different, sometimes totally conflicting viewpoints. And that's what Moses is speaking directly to in these instructions.
Okay, so first let's set the scene. We're talking roughly 40 years after the Exodus, according to our source. So the generation that, witnessed those incredible events, the plagues, the Red Sea, all of that, they've mostly passed on. So now Moses is talking to their children, and they're on the plains of Moab, like right on the edge of the Promised Land.
Literally on the doorstep, about to step into a whole new chapter, the wilderness wandering's over, and a whole new set of challenges is waiting on the other side.
And the timing here is super significant. This is it for Moses. This is like his last act, his final assignment before he dies. It's kind of like you can really sense that weight, that responsibility in his words. The document, it frames the book of Deuteronomy as essentially a collection of sermons that Moses is giving to this new generation. And it's all about prepping them for what's coming next in Canaan.
It's like he's going back to basics, Deuteronomy, it's called the second law sometimes. But it's not just a repeat. He's tailoring the message, really trying to make sure these core principles, the ones from their covenant with God, really sink in, get down deep into their hearts.
Okay, so right at the heart of all this, the source really stresses this. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. It's from Deuteronomy 6.4 to 5. This is like the bedrock, the foundation. It's like Moses is saying, if you get nothing else, get this.
The Shema, yeah. It's absolutely fundamental. But, even in this short statement, there's so much packed in, so many layers of meaning and different ways to understand what it meant for the Israelites then.
So the source goes into some of those different ways of looking at it, right?
Yeah.
What were some of the ways this phrase could have been understood back then?
Okay, so one way to look at it, and scholars debate this because of grammar in the Hebrew, it's that there's only one Yahweh, period. Now, the Bible consistently presents Yahweh as the God of Israel, but the way it's worded here, it leaves some room for discussion. Like, is it an absolute statement of monotheism, in the strictest sense?
So maybe not so much a declaration about like the whole universe and all that, but more focused on Israel's specific relationship with Yahweh.
Right, exactly. Which leads to another really strong interpretation, which is that, okay, Yahweh is the only God for Israel. So their worship, their loyalty, all of that, it belongs to him alone. And they have to reject all the other gods they're going to run into in Canaan. And that makes a lot of sense when you think about what they're about to do. Walk into a land where everyone's got their own gods they've been worshiping for centuries. It's this powerful call to exclusive devotion.
Okay, so that makes sense. It's like a line in the sand. What other ways were there to understand this?
Well, SAS scholars see it as a statement about how unique Yahweh is. He's not like those other gods. I mean, think about it. They've seen him do incredible things. Exodus, the plagues, the wilderness, all of that. They've seen his power. They've seen his character. It's nothing like the gods of Egypt.
Yeah.
So this could be saying he's in a category of his own. It could also be saying he's the only true God, period. Even if other cultures have their own, like local gods, ultimately, he's the one who's really in charge. He's the one with true authority over everything.
So is that like a universal claim kind of wrapped up in this specific instruction to Israel?
Exactly. And then there's a fifth way to understand it that the source points out, and this one is particularly relevant to what they're about to face in Canaan. It's the idea that Yahweh is consistently one God. He doesn't change depending on where you are. Unlike a lot of the ancient gods who were seen as having like different forms or different powers in different places. Think about Baal, the Canaanite god. He might be worshipped in one way in one city and a totally different way in another, but Yahweh, he's presented as always being the same. The God who brought them out of Egypt, the God who was with them in the desert, he's going to be the same God in Canaan. He doesn't have, like, different regional variations.
That's a really important distinction to make, I think, especially when you're about to enter a new place with a whole pantheon of gods that are already there.
Yeah.
It's like it reinforces that idea that their God is consistent, he's everywhere, and he doesn't change.
Absolutely. And, no matter which of those interpretations resonated most with a particular Israelite, the practical implication was crystal clear. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. That's what this central truth demanded. Total loyalty, unwavering affection, complete commitment, all in.
Okay, so once he lays down that foundation, Moses moves on to prepping them for what they're actually going to face in Canaan. It's like he's saying, here's the truth you need to cling to. Now, let me tell you about all the lies you're going to hear.
That's a great way to put it. And he starts by tackling this issue of false worship. We see it in Deuteronomy chapter 4. And one of the main things he focuses on is this really strong prohibition against making any kind of image of Yahweh. Why do you think that is?
Well, the source makes a big point that because the Israelites didn't actually see a physical form of God when he spoke to them at Horeb, Mount Sinai, any attempt to create an image would just be like so lacking. It'd be missing the point entirely, almost disrespectful. How could you capture something that's like infinite and beyond form in a statue?
Yeah, exactly. And it wasn't just about, failing to capture God's essence. The danger went further because when you make an image, people tend to start worshiping the image itself rather than what it's supposed to represent.
Right. It can also lead to this idea of God being localized, like he's only present where the statue is. And that goes totally against the idea of Yahweh being everywhere, which they just affirmed in the Shema. It's like trying to put limits on something that's limitless.
And there's the whole thing about worshiping the sun, moon, and stars. That was a pretty common thing in the ancient world, wasn't it? Oh, totally. It was everywhere. But what the source points out is that in the creation story, they're just created things. They're tools in God's hands. He uses them to mark the seasons, to provide light, all that. But they're not divine themselves. They're not gods. Bowing down to them would be like totally missing the point. It's like worshiping the hammer instead of the carpenter.
So in Deuteronomy chapter 12, Moses shifts to talking about false worship sites. And this is where we get introduced to some of the big names in the Canaanite world of gods.
Yeah, we meet El. He's considered the top god in the Canaanite pantheon. Although by this time, Baal, his son, the storm god, he'd become way more prominent, especially because he was linked to fertility. He brought the rain, the life-giving rain. And then you have Asherah. She's El's consort, and she's often shown as the mother of a lot of the gods.
And how do the Canaanites worship them? The text talks about altars, these standing stones and wooden poles, sometimes whole groves of trees that were sacred.
Right. The standing stones, or masboth, they were often linked to Baal. They represented his presence, his power. Then you have the wooden poles, or sometimes living trees and groves. They called them Asherim. Those were all about Asherah. They symbolized her connection to life, fertility, all of that. And these places of worship, they were often set up on hilltops, They called them the high places, or Bamoth. A lot of ancient cultures thought that these elevated spots were closer to the heavens, natural places where the gods and humans could kind of connect.
And the way they worshipped at these places, it sounds pretty different from the structured worship that the Israelites were used to with Yahweh. The source even mentions this thing where sexual acts were part of Baal worship. It was like a magical ritual, right?
Yeah.
Meant to ensure a good harvest.
Yeah, it was quite different. The text doesn't shy away from these details. It even mentions that image of rain being considered Baal's semen. I know it's a little graphic, but it's there to highlight how different their understanding of the divine was and how it, interacted with the natural world. It really underscores how foreign these practices were to the Israelites.
So when Moses commands them to destroy these worship sites, the altars, the standing stones, the ashram, it's not just about, religious intolerance. It's deeper than that, right?
Absolutely. It was about preventing this thing called syncretism. That's where you start blending different religious ideas, different practices. Moses knew how tempting it would be for the Israelites to kind of, I don't know, pick and choose elements from these Canaanite traditions and mix them into their own worship. Yahweh demanded exclusive devotion. He wanted them to worship him in a central place, a place he would choose. It was about maintaining the purity of their faith, keeping them from being pulled into what he considered idolatry.
And then in Deuteronomy chapter 13, Moses tackles a really tricky subject: false prophets. Prophecy wasn't just an Israelite thing in the ancient world, was it? Lots of cultures had their own ways of, like, getting messages from the divine.
Oh, yeah. It was common. Prophets were everywhere. Each culture had its own, and they all claimed to get messages from their gods in different ways. Our source mentions things like rhabdomancy, which is divination using rods or staffs. There's also hepatoscopy. That's when they would examine the livers of animals, looking for signs, omens. And then there was incubation. People would sleep in these shrines, hoping to get messages from the gods in their dreams.
So in that kind of setting, how were the Israelites, who were still relatively new on the scene, supposed to tell the difference between a real prophet of Yahweh and a fake one who was promoting some other god?
That's where Moses' instructions get really important. He warns them that false prophets might even pop up among the Israelites themselves. And get this, they might even be able to perform miracles or make predictions that come true. So the real test, it wasn't whether they could do something supernatural or if they, got lucky with a prediction.
It all came down to the content of their message, right?
Right. If a prophet, no matter how impressive they seemed, no matter what they could do, if they started saying, hey, let's worship these other beings, they were to be rejected. No question. The text even suggests that those miracles, those signs, they could be a test from Yahweh. It's like he's seeing how strong their loyalty really is. Will they stay true to him, even if they're presented with some really convincing evidence pointing in another direction? It's a really powerful reminder that things aren't always what they seem. Don't just get caught up in the spectacle. Focus on the message, the substance.
That's so important. It's easy to get distracted by flashy stuff. So after that, Deuteronomy chapter 18 gets into other, quote, false and evil practices. And this is where things get, well, a little disturbing. This is about some of the darker aspects of Canaanite culture.
Yeah, this is tough stuff. This section outright condemns child sacrifice, which was practiced by the Canaanites. Yahweh absolutely forbade it for the Israelites. It shows you this huge moral gulf between their ways and what God commanded.
It's just awful to even think about. And then beyond that, there's this whole list of magical practices that are forbidden: divination, fortune-telling, interpreting omens, sorcery, casting spells, consulting mediums, and necromancy, which is, trying to get guidance from the dead. It's a pretty long list.
Yeah, the Canaanites used all kinds of methods to try and understand or manipulate the supernatural, and they did it outside of the established worship of their gods. The source talks about the idea of familiar spirits. They were often connected with mediums and necromancers. It's this idea of like a spirit that acts as your guide, your source of secret knowledge.
So why were all these forms of magic forbidden? What was the big idea behind that prohibition?
The core issue is upholding the idea of one God, of monotheism, and recognizing that Yahweh is the ultimate authority. When you mess around with these practices, it implies that there are other powers out there, other sources of knowledge that are just as good as God or even better. That undermines the whole exclusive relationship that God wants with Israel. It suggests that they can find guidance, they can get control through these other means, and they don't need him.
But in the midst of all this warning about false prophets and forbidden practices, there's also this glimmer of hope, isn't there? Moses assures them that Yahweh will raise up a true prophet, someone like him.
Yes. And he explains the Hebrew term nabi, which means spokesperson. Even Aaron, Moses' brother, served as his nabi in a way. He spoke for Moses. And Yahweh's prophets, their job would be to faithfully communicate God's word, God's will to the people.
And our source points out that, yeah, they could expect a line of prophets, but there was also this expectation of a special prophet who would be, I don't know, on a whole other level, someone who'd be like Moses, some of that same kind of direct connection with God.
Exactly. God spoke to a lot of prophets through dreams, visions, that kind of thing. But with Moses, it was different. There was this intimacy. He spoke to God face to face. They believed that someday a prophet would come who would have that same level of access, that same closeness to God. And when that prophet came, they had to listen. They had to obey.
Okay, so in Deuteronomy chapter 34, the source talks about this leadership transition. Moses doesn't end up leading them into the promised land himself, does he?
No. After giving all those powerful messages and pronouncements, he climbs Mount Nebo. And from there, God lets him see the whole promised land spread out before him. And then he dies. Right there on the mountain, just before reaching the destination he's been leading his people towards for 40 years. It's a really powerful moment, the end of an era.
So who takes over? Who steps up?
Joshua. And the text highlights that God himself buries Moses. That just shows you how special his relationship with God was. And Joshua, he's divinely chosen to be the successor. Moses lays his hands on him, passes on his wisdom, and importantly, the people follow Joshua. They show that same obedience to God that they had under Moses, and they finally cross the Jordan River and enter the Promised Land.
So when you put it all together, this whole deep dive into Moses' final instructions, it all points to this one central message. Yahweh is the one true God. That's it. That's the whole point. All this prep for Canaan, it was about making sure the Israelites understood this truth deep down. It was about giving them the tools they'd need to resist all the other beliefs and practices that were waiting for them in Canaan. It was about strength, you know?
You got it. It was like spiritual boot camp, getting them ready, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually for what they were about to face. Moses understood better than anyone that Canaan wasn't just a different place, it was a different worldview. And that posed a huge threat to their identity, to their covenant with God. He knew the battle for their hearts, for their minds, it was going to be just as important as any battle fought with swords and spears.
And that brings us back to us today. It makes you think, we're bombarded with information all the time. So many different opinions, so many people claiming to have the truth. It's kind of like our own Canaan, isn't it?
Okay.
So what are the modern day counterfeits that we need to be on the lookout for? How do we figure out what's real? What's actually true in all this noise with all these voices shouting at us?
That's the question, isn't it? And the things that Moses was talking about, they still applied. He was saying, focus on the truth, be careful about things that look good on the surface, be aware of deception, find reliable sources you can trust. These are all still valid today, whether you're in the ancient world or, scrolling through your phone in 2023.
It's so true. And it makes you think about that idea of commitment, right? It's not enough to just say, yeah, I believe that. Moses was calling for something deeper, loving with all your heart, your soul, your might. What is that kind of all-in devotion, that kind of love? What does that actually look like for us when it comes to believing in something, when it comes to truth? That's a question I think we all need to keep thinking about long after this deep dive is over.